Thank you to the new Tropic for having us. It's good to be back on day 2. Before we get into a quick recap of day 1, we should introduce our special guest, who's Maya. Maya works full-time with Trolleys Alliance as our campaign organizer. When did you start working with us, actually? Very recently.
June 3rd.
June 3rd.
June 3rd.
How is it so far?
A whirlwind. It's been a whirlwind, but
Maya's primary project is the Better Bus project. So if you are emailing the Better Bus project, Maya's likely on the other side. Right now we open the phone line where you can actually schedule a call to talk with the Better Bus project team. Maya might be on the other side of that. Maya might be on the other side of many things, actually. And of course, from yesterday we have Scudder Wag
Good evening.
with Jerry Walker and Associates. I'm the director of Trolleys Alliance. So we're just like yesterday's format. We're going to talk for about 15 minutes about today's main topic. Today's main topic is what should be the priorities for the bus system and how we're going to decide those. We'll talk for 15 minutes. We'll take your questions for 15 minutes, and yeah. That's it. So let's start off with a recap of yesterday.
Yeah.
Yesterday we mainly talked about frequency, and I'm going to switch back to the map that we had yesterday, where basically yesterday we talked about we have this whole county map, and we've color coded all the routes by frequency.
Because frequency is so essential to determining how useful transit is for most trips. Because so many transit trips, a lot of your travel time is waiting time. Waiting for the bus to arrive, waiting to transfer between buses to get where you're going. And even if you have real-time information, you're waiting at some point. Even if you're not waiting when the bus is, coming down the street, because you can get out there right when it's coming. If it's an hourly route and you get there at 7:02 or 8:02 and you have to clock in for your job at 8 a.m., you're gonna get there at 7:02 and you're gonna wait 58 minutes. So waiting happens, and frequency is essential to that.
Something we observed yesterday, and I'm sorry this is a little hard to see, but when you look at the entire county, what you see in red is a bus that arrives every 15 minutes or less on a weekday at noon. And as a county, I'm going to zoom in a little bit on this, we don't have a lot of red, which means we don't, and I'm going to scroll from the top to the bottom, we don't have a lot of frequent routes, and we don't have essentially a frequent bus network that's very usable to get to a lot of places. So that's the main thing that we talked about yesterday.
And when you compare, say, this network you have in Miami to kind of other comparable Sunbelt cities, Houston and Phoenix, most of those cities have a more consistent and larger frequent grid across, significant portions of the dense built-up parts of the city, and you don't have that here.
And I should mention that I live in Miami without a car. Maya, you also live in Miami without a car. What's been your personal experiences with the frequency of the system, just anecdotally?
I live alongside of really high frequency routes. The 93 takes me straight down Biscayne pretty frequently, pretty easily. So I'm in a well-served area in terms of transit, but it's also very expensive to live where I live. So that's sort of a trade-off that I made.
Yeah, and it's also essentially it's a very good point, because the more we have so few corridors that are high frequency that if you don't have a car in Miami, there's very few places you can live without a car in Miami, because there's very little high frequency transit, and that means generally those places are more expensive.
And the challenge when you think about frequency is the frequency is extremely useful to everyone, but it costs the county a lot of money to provide frequency. If you double frequency, you basically double the cost of the service you provide.
Yeah.
So if you go from 30-minute frequency to 15-minute frequency, that's twice as many buses on the street, twice as many drivers on the street.
Yeah.
It's very expensive.
Yeah. So the main decision, one of the main decisions I should say, for a bus system redesign is how much to invest in creating more frequency services, so that's more buses that run very often all throughout the day, and how much to invest in making sure that people have bus service. Maybe it's not as frequent, but they have bus service. And the great way, and we're going to illustrate this in terms of a little diagram. So Scudder, if you will introduce us to our fictional town here that will demonstrate this idea quite well.
So because frequency is so expensive, you want to deploy it in the places where it can be the most useful to the most people. So this little town, which I want to make sure I got the right place here.
Yeah, you got the town.
This is a little fictional city. All the gray lines are streets you can run buses on, and all the little dots are people in jobs. And you see there's a lot of them along kind of the two major straight streets. And this little town's only got 18 buses. Every town, you only have as much money as, you're always limited to some degree in how much you can spend.
Mhm.
And so the question is, if you want to create a network that is as frequent as possible and as useful as possible for the most people, that's trying to go towards a high frequency, high ridership type design.
Mhm.
And you're going to then put all your service into as few routes as possible in the busiest places.
Mhm.
And so you're going to end up with something that looks like this. Basically 2 routes on the two busiest, densest, most active streets. And you're going to take 9 buses and put them on each of those 2 routes so that there's a bus coming every 10 minutes.
Mhm.
And a lot of people will find it really valuable and really useful because you walk out, you don't have to think about a schedule. And when you transfer between those 2 routes, you don't have to worry about the timing because you get off of one bus and there's another bus coming on another route, and it, at least 10 minutes, no more than 10 minutes.
Mhm.
So for like 70% of the people in that town, they're near really useful, really frequent service.
Mhm.
The downside is, there's about 30% of people who aren't served, and that means, they might feel like, hey, I pay taxes too, I deserve something. They might feel like that's very fair.
Yeah.
But when you're thinking about transit that's trying to be the most useful to the most people, you're thinking kind of like a little bit like a business. Go to the markets where you're gonna do the best.
Mhm.
And that's what you do in a ridership-oriented design,
Mhm.
in a frequency-oriented
And,
design.
and we're going to talk about the decision and the survey in a second with Maya, but let's do the contrasting example
Yeah.
first, where this is another way to answer that same question.
So the contrasting kind of design, the other extreme is if the community, if elected leaders feel like everyone deserves to have a bus stop near them, deserves to have some service near them so that there's always a lifeline access, that you can always get out, then you design a network that looks kind of like this. And you have all of these green lines, which are individual routes
Mhm.
going on just about every street in the town. But because you have so many routes now, instead of, you have 10, 15, or 12 routes instead of just 2, you can only run 1 or 2 buses on each route.
Mhm.
So there's only a bus coming on once an hour,
Mhm. Mhm.
which means it's really hard to transfer between routes.
Mhm.
You have a long wait for anything, and so most people don't find the service very useful.
Mhm.
And so far fewer people ride.
Mhm.
But, Mrs. Smith down in the southeast corner of the town, she's got a bus stop near her house. She's got something.
Mhm.
And that's a coverage-oriented design. You're focusing on putting service as far as possible into every corner of the county and the city,
Mhm.
so that everyone has a little bit of something.
And just to reiterate, like systems like that have more frequent services tend to have more ridership.
They tend to have more ridership relative to what you're spending on service.
Right. And whereas systems that are designed more like this, like the coverage model, tend to cover more people.
Have covered more people. There are more people near a stop, but far fewer people use it because it's not as useful, and so you tend to have lower ridership relative to what you spend.
So every system is a mix of these 2 goals, right? It's a mix of providing frequent service and providing a lot of coverage to people.
No system is all one or all the other.
And there are 2 main ways that we're going to sort of help answer what that mix should be for the concepts. Not what it should be in the end, but what it should be from the concepts. And I'm wondering if, Maya, you want to talk a bit about the experience of the priorities workshop that we held, which was, so we had a workshop with county elected officials, municipal elected officials, and major community organizations that leaders of which attended this workshop. And do you want to describe sort of what happened and what the experience was?
Sure. So we asked these people to do essentially what was a thought experiment. If we have a fictional city that has like a downtown business area, a low-income area, a high-income area, a university, a hospital, how should we distribute bus routes that run at different frequencies throughout this fictional city? And it was really hard for people, I think, at first to divorce that from the reality of Miami. Like, but what about this? But what about that? What about where the elderly people live? What about Mrs. Jones who lives down the street who really needs her bus route? And so we took it at like a 30,000 feet level and asked people to think about it conceptually. And they all came up with very different systems depending on what they as a group, because we split everyone into different groups with their own little fictional cities, to develop their transit plans. They all came up with different things based on what they valued. So some people said, I really want to prioritize making sure that low-income people can get to their jobs in downtown. Other people said, I want service spread out throughout the city, regardless of who they are and where they're going. Some people said, I really want people to get to the medical center. And so you see all these different concept plans emerge, and it tells you that it really depends on what the community values. And so that's where my role comes in sort of determining what the community wants out of its transit system.
Mm-hmm. And that priorities workshop, of course, was small with a limited audience, and that's why we have this survey, which, don't worry, I know you can't read it. We'll read out the questions and we'll tell you what this is, and also we'll encourage you to take it, but just to go over what these survey questions are and how they relate to this question. But before we do that, I think people would love to get a sense of like, how many people have responded to the survey so far, and how is this survey being deployed?
It's being deployed online. I've been aggressively deploying it online. And also we have 6 transit fellows who are out on the ground wearing these bright orange obnoxious t-shirts.
Obnoxious?
Obnoxious.
That's our brand color.
It's a very bright color. We don't want them to get hit by buses or by Maseratis.
Now you're talking.
And they're at bus terminals, they're at transit terminals, and they're chasing people down with clipboards, asking them to answer this survey. And it gets sort of frustrating to the public because there are so many things wrong with our transit system here. People say there aren't enough bus shelters, the buses are smelly, there's a contracted route and it doesn't serve me well enough. And so the pitch that they have to give to the public and what I have to give to them is that this is the lowest hanging fruit in improving our public transit system, is a bus route redesign. We can get around to fixing bus shelters, we can get around to expanding Metro Rail, but something that we can fix the fastest and in the most cost-neutral way is a bus route network redesign. And though it may be unfulfilling to answer these questions, it will inform something that will impact you pretty fast.
Mm-hmm. So how many responses do we have so far? And then we'll talk about the survey itself.
So 1,500, but our goal is 2,000. And so I'm gonna plug the survey because I want a lot more people to answer.
Let's go through some of the questions so we can get a sense of like how these relate to the questions that we were talking about. So the first question is, and I'm going to read it out literally, and then I'm going to pass it over to you, Scudder, for our whiteboard diagram. So the first question is, would you rather have 3 options: a shorter walk to the bus stop, but a long wait for the bus? So a short walk to the bus stop, but then you're standing here for quite a while. A longer walk to the bus stop, but a short wait for the bus. So like you walk a bit longer, but the bus comes more frequently. Or I don't care, I will do whatever gets me there the fastest. And Scudder, maybe you want to explain like what this question exactly means. Why the relationship between how far you walk is important to the amount of frequency that maybe a system could provide.
So you only have so many buses, you only have so many dollars to spend on service. And the ridership coverage trade-off, kind of the lived experience on the ground for a lot of people is whether you have to walk farther and wait less or have a short walk. So this little example of two bus routes, and you live here. This is a 30-minute route, this is a 30-minute route. And today you can walk right out your front door, but you've got kind of a long wait because the bus is only coming every 30 minutes. That means on average you wait 15 minutes. You just walk out your door at any given time. And that might work for some people, but for other people, I can't wait that long. In a more frequency-oriented, higher ridership system, we might say, hey, look, here's the trade-off. We'll take away this route over here, and now you've got a 6-minute walk to this route, but this route is now every 15 minutes instead. And yes, it takes you 6 more minutes to get to the bus stop, but you save at least 7.5 minutes on average travel time. So you get where you're going at least 1.5 minutes faster.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the experience for a lot of people across the whole system.
Mm-hmm. And Maya, do you want to talk about people's reactions to this question?
So this is conceptual. People say, well, what does it matter? What distance are you talking about? If a longer walk or a shorter walk, do you mean a mile? Do you mean a half mile? People want concrete sort of answers. And also, walkability throughout our county really, really varies based on where you are. So if you're in Omni or downtown, you can walk without feeling like you're going to be run down. But in other parts of the county, like Doral or Kendall, they're not as walkable, they're not as friendly. And so the experience walking to your bus stop is much different, and so people's opinions on them vary.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Do you want to address maybe how these questions are vague because they can't be specific right now?
Yeah, so at this first phase, in this first part of the project where we're asking these questions before we really have any ideas of what it might look like on the ground, is a way to get a general sense of what direction people think they might want to go. The next phase of this project, later in the fall, we will actually have two contrasting concepts showing you what would it look like in Miami to have a high frequency, high ridership type network.
So more like the red diagram we were seeing.
Exactly, and then another that looks more like the green diagram.
Yeah.
And then we will have another round of opportunity for people to respond in another survey that really gives a more concrete way of seeing what it means.
Yeah.
So, it's a way of getting people introduced to this idea and then coming back to people with a more concrete representation of what it's like.
I want to go through these two questions very quickly, and then we'll open it up to questions that are not these questions. So the other two questions are, should we run more buses where we have the most bus riders in Miami-Dade County and less service everywhere else, keeping the number of buses the same? So again, should we run more buses in the place where we have more bus riders and less buses where we have less bus riders? And it goes from I strongly agree to I agree, I'm neutral, I disagree, and I strongly disagree. And what this question really means is, yesterday we were talking about the density of activity. What this really means is, should we concentrate on the areas where transit is the most successful service in order to build a more high frequency network? Any other comments from you guys?
I would just add to that, the ridership recipe for getting more people on the bus is to go where it's dense, walkable, linear, and proximate.
Yeah.
And so
those are a lot of heavy words though.
They are.
Which we will explain maybe
We'll explain
next
later.
time. But basically there are factors that lead to buses having a lot of people on them.
I have one comment also.
Yeah.
I really want to emphasize keeping the number of buses the same, because I've had several people write on these surveys saying, get more buses.
Yeah.
Get more buses. And it's hard to explain that this is a cost neutral program where we don't obtain more buses. Ideally we would, but given that we don't have control, you and I personally don't have control over the number of buses. Scudder does. No, he doesn't. He does not. Nobody at this table has control over the number of buses in the county. It would be ideal to get more, but we don't.
Yeah.
So how should we distribute the existing amount of resources that we have?
Well, and also something we were talking about on our walk. The two counterbalances to it are, one, we could do absolutely nothing, which is also bad. And two, even if there were more buses being added, which we shouldn't rule out the possibilities because your politicians are responsible for this, these questions are still as important, because you can't add 100 buses and then without any sort of understanding of what to do with them just decide, we're just going to put buses everywhere, but what are they going to do?
The other important point about these questions is if you're adding service, if you're keeping this whole amount of service same, if you're cutting service, understanding what the community wants to prioritize and how it wants to balance these goals is important, no matter how much service you have or how much you're adding.
Yeah.
It's still important to know, because you've got to balance these goals properly for everyone.
Yeah. Okay, last question, because we're running over time. I broke my promise. Should we remove buses on the least popular routes to increase service on the most crowded routes, keeping the number of buses the same? And that's basically a question of, we have a lot of bus services in Miami-Dade County that frankly just don't carry a lot of people and are very expensive to run. That's not to say that they are bad, but relatively speaking, they're less productive than the routes that maybe could have more frequency and have more people. Any further comments from you guys in terms of that question?
I would just say, when you think about it, a bus that is mostly empty is not a bus that's necessarily failing. If that bus is there for meeting a coverage goal, then it's meeting its purpose. But we need to think about, is that bus meeting the coverage goals that the county and the community wants it to meet?
Yeah. And again, this is why these questions exist. They're questions. So you can take this survey, this exact survey. It's not as pretty online as it is on a paper. But you can take the survey at betterbus.miami/survey. That's betterbus.miami/survey. And I think we should open up to questions, because we've talked way too long.
Yeah.
We've talked way too long. But we had so much fun.
Mostly my fault.
No, it's okay. How do you explain all this so quickly? What do we have?
So far we have a question from Kristen. She's asking, so when this model is enacted in other parts of the country, which is basically the model of walking farther and increasing frequency of the routes, what's the sort of average walking time that people experience?
Pretty better.
Yeah, so the research tells us that people are willing to walk farther if they have a shorter wait. So higher frequency service does tend to draw people from a longer distance. The typical distance we look at is about a quarter mile is the really core market area for most bus service. But people will go up to about a half a mile. It's a 10-minute walk at average pace. Is a half a mile. Personally, I walk a half a mile usually at the beginning or end of my trip, depending on what I do, where I live up in DC. And so that's the common range of what you would expect. Beyond a half a mile, relatively few people will walk that far.
I personally find myself in Miami walking up to 10 minutes because when you saw that map, and I might even bring it up again, just to illustrate how strong of a point that is. When you have a bus route that's frequent, that's running all day, so essentially the red lines on this map, and I'm focusing on downtown because there's no other red lines in the other parts of the county beyond downtown and the beach. When I'm looking for a red line bus, which means arriving every 15 minutes or less, I'm willing to walk 10 minutes because I know as soon as I get there, there'll be a bus. I'm not willing to do that for a bus that runs 30, 60 minutes. And that essentially is the trade-off.
That's pretty much it as far as questions so far. So
comments, anger, happiness.
No, just mostly we have Alex here who's asking, who's just said thanks for taking this on. We did just get a question from Greg who asked how many routes will be redesigned in this project.
We're basically looking at the entire Miami-Dade transit network, so all county routes. There are a few that are not being redesigned because they're funded by other people than the county, but they are run by the county. And then we are working with the City of Miami and the City of Miami Beach and looking at their trolley routes and Coral Gables in addition. We certainly are interested in talking potentially with some of the other municipalities, but those municipalities carry about 75% of the trolley riders.
The City of Miami, Beach, Coral Gables.
And therefore are kind of the most significant trolley networks.
Yeah.
Is that Greg Gilliard?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I messaged him on Facebook yesterday. Greg, if you're listening, check your, it's a different inbox that exists on Facebook. I'm in there because I'm not your friend on Facebook, but I would like to talk. It's always hidden.
You can't find it.
I know. Well, I did try to get in contact with you. As said, I'm the back end of all of this, and I receive all the messages, so I will reach out to you.
Anything else, Hans?
Yeah, so actually, Greg says thank you, by the way. So we actually got one from former Commissioner Juan Zapata, who asked, does the age of riders impact the design or redesign of these routes?
Great question. Because actually, on this survey, which we didn't really mention, but on this survey, we do record everyone's age, including their race, what buses they use, their home zip code, and some other demographic information. So we, in terms of when they ask this question, when we ask, shorter walk to the bus stop, longer walk to the bus stop, what trade-off would you have? We also have the age information to see how different age groups are responding to that question.
And also, when the choices report gets released next week, we're aiming for, you'll see in there we have mapped, where are there concentrations of seniors? Where are there concentrations of people in poverty? Where are there concentrations of other people, with slightly different needs potentially, and so on, as part of looking at what's the most appropriate design, or what's the best design we can create to meet the needs. The other thing I want to point out, though, in response to that, is a high ridership network is a network that gets a lot of different people from diverse backgrounds of all kinds on the bus. And it's a network that isn't designed around every individual interest group and it's not going to make all the seniors happy. It's not going to make all of the young people happy. It's not going to make all of the business people happy. It's not going to make, it's going to be something that, is about 80% good for all of those people.
Yeah.
And therefore, a lot of people will find it useful and ride it.
Yeah.
You ride the New York City subway, you have Michael Bloomberg,
yeah.
a billionaire,
yeah.
and you have, the person cleaning hotel rooms.
Yeah.
All on the same vehicle.
Yeah.
Gotcha. So actually, yeah, a couple more questions have come in just since we've been talking. So we had a question here from Jeffrey, and I guess he's sort of just asking about the focus that you all have on redesigning buses. And Maya, it seems like you kind of got to this point a little bit, but he basically is asking, you know, why not focus on something like the Metro Rail when bus lanes like this or like the redesign seems mostly feasible on like a high traffic route like US 1 or something like that. So why the focus on this and not something like Metro Rail, for example?
Okay, I'll try to answer that in 30 seconds. Transit Alliance is an organization where we've advocated for a lot of different things, including we have positions on the smart plan, we have positions on the budget, we have positions on a lot of things. In terms of the thing that's most achievable right now, because we have lost around 25 million bus boardings in the past 4 years, it is a critical situation. If we cannot run a good, productive, successful bus network, and I know those are vague words and we can measure those in a few different ways, but the way we define it essentially, the way as we a community define is like a good, successful bus network, we don't really have much hope for investing in a lot of transit in the future. Because 2 out of 3 of our transit riders right now, they're on the buses. They're not on trains, they're not on gondolas, they're not on monorails, they're not flying around in flying taxis for sure. They're on the buses. Which is why it makes this such a critical issue where we won't be able to move much forward if we don't address this. And I will say that in the context and in the history of knowing that, we are a county of failed promises. We never disregard that. We've taxed ourselves for transit that we've never received. We've planned transit that we've never done. Very aware. But all of this has come down to the fact that because we failed so much, the one thing that we actually have in terms of resources, we have nearly 800 buses, we aren't doing very well. That's why we're redesigning it.
I would also just add that the best argument for a bus lane or a big investment in something rail is, you know, a bus every 7 minutes that's full.
Yeah.
All day long.
Yeah, and let's be clear, we do not have a single bus in Miami-Dade County that runs every 7 minutes.
Right.
And there's a possibility that through this process, not that I'm saying it will happen, but it could be on the table that in the corridors where it makes the most sense, we could have a proposal for a bus to run every 7 minutes. And no one in Miami-Dade County has experienced that level of frequency.
At least not anytime recently.
At least not anytime recently. So.
Gotcha. So we have another question from Sylvina, I believe. She asked, will trolleys overlap their service with these bus routes as part of this redesign?
Great question.
I love that question.
I know, we might talk about it a little more next week, but the point of this project, to a large degree with the trolleys, is to de-duplicate service. And I'm wondering if either of you guys want to jump in on that a little bit.
I would say looking at opportunities to redeploy services and find the right roles between municipal trolley services and the county services and negotiate those roles so that you don't have as much duplication or you get rid of all of it, and you put the trolley where it makes the most sense for the city, and you put the county service where it makes the most sense for the longer distance trips, you know, all the way across the county.
And this is the first project that actually aims to do that, which for us, for Transit Alliance, is major because this comes to the foundation of how we make our decisions about transit. For example, a lot of people talk about Metro Rail, a lot of people talk about transit expansion. Would you really trust that to happen when we can't even figure out the basics of, hey, let's not run a free trolley service on top of a paid county service and have both of them cannibalize each other? If we can't figure that out, I would say, let's not start building rail tomorrow just yet.
There's also another opportunity for how the trolleys and the county buses interact. If they're running on the same corridors for good reasons, trolleys can be like the local stops and the county bus can be like the max, which only stops every half a mile or so on. That's another way trolleys and county buses can be complementary as opposed to duplicative if they're running on the same street. The other way is to say, hey, city, you run on this street, hey, and we're going to run on this street, you know, a quarter mile or a half mile over here, as opposed to running half the frequency on both streets for both services, which is much less useful.
Just to wrap up, Maya, have you been hearing anything about trolleys in particular during the surveying process? Has it come up as a topic or not really?
Not as much. I think some people have had specific complaints about their trolley systems being not air conditioned or dirty, which Yeah.
More servicey issues.
More servicey issues and not so much frequency or how much they walk.
We would call that a question of, is the service civilized?
Is it civilized? No. No, it's not.
Whoa. Next question.
Gotcha. So last one I guess we'll wrap up with here is also from Kristen, who's been tuning in for a while. She asked, how often does a redesign like this happen? Like if, let's say Butterbrush project wasn't, on the table, like you all weren't looking at this intensely, how often does a redesign like this happen?
So the last time that something similar to this, but not like this, and I'm making that line very clear, because this process, as this process exists, I believe has not occurred in the county before. But somewhat of a route realignment, somewhat of a comprehensive route alignment, the last time it happened was when Metrorail and the OmniLoop opened, which was like 1985, 1986, which was a major change to the entire transit system, right? Because you have a new rail line, you have a new OmniLoop going north, and there was a major realignment to try and have the bus services integrated with that. There have been studies and plans since then, but none of them are like this or have led to any sort of significant.
We like studying and planning things.
Yeah, generally Miami is very good at studying and planning things and not really doing anything. Scott, do you have any history to provide?
I mean, I would say that it's something the community should undertake maybe every 20 or 30 years.
Which would be like 1986 to now. It's like sort of we're at the right time. And Miami has changed a lot in the last 30 years.
Naturally, every transit agency, every community will, do some sort of assessment kind of every year. What's working, what's not working, make a little bit of incremental change. But that usually doesn't result in, big, significant adjustments. And that sort of kind of clean slate rethinking is something every 20 or 30 years.
Yeah.
Gotcha. We got, just one last one.
Better be a good one.
Well, yes, it's a clarifying question from Mark. He just wants to, he's asking, so to make sure he understands, one of the core focuses in the revamp of the bus network, is it to reduce stops per route in order to decrease ride time?
We will talk about
that. Question.
We will talk about that on Thursday.
Or Wednesday.
No. Tomorrow we actually have a great special guest. Really tune in for that tomorrow.
Okay.
We have someone from Transit.
Oh. I have no idea what's coming tomorrow. You're the man who knows all this.
I only know the secrets.
Surprising.
I should have my hat now. But on Thursday, we'll talk specifically. We'll try to make sure it's in there about stop spacing, how that matters so much towards how bus systems run.
And I'll have more whiteboard.
Yeah. So we will talk about stop spacing because I want to give you the full explanation to that. Giving you a short explanation now will just be a bit sad and demoralizing, but the full explanation is actually very interesting. Because again, this project is focused on making the bus system more useful for more people, period. And that means making some decisions about how do you make bus stops more useful for the most amount of people and the most efficient bus service, which is quite a fascinating thing that even I wasn't fully educated on. So yeah, Thursday.
Okay. Gotcha. Well, he says awesome and thanks, and that's pretty much it.
No, thank you so much again. Thank you so much for tuning in today too. Thank you, Maya. Thank you, Scudder.
Yes.
We'll be back tomorrow at 6 o'clock with a very special guest from the transit department. And we'll be talking about, what are we talking about exactly? Do you remember from the outline?
I have no idea.
That'll be a surprise too. You'll find out in our e-blast tomorrow. I know what we're talking about, but it's just kidding.
Okay.
But don't worry, it'll be fun. It'll be as fun as today. I hope. So thank you very much.
Thank you.